Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Tree School Online. It's 3 o'clock, and I'm Glenn Ahrens, OSU Extension Forester for Clackamas, Marion, and Hood River counties. It's my pleasure to be your host for today's Tree School Online webinar. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. We want to give special thanks to the Oregon Forest Resources Institute for leading this project and to the U.S. Forest Service and Oregon Department of Forestry for giving us a grant to cover our expenses. Tree School Online webinars are offered every first and third Tuesday of the month now through June 2021. Also, there's another series of webinars on managing Eastern Oregon forests being offered by my extension colleagues in Eastern Oregon, and that's on selected Thursday evenings at 6 p.m. Please visit the Tree School Online page on the knowyourforest.org website for updates on both Tree School Online and managing Eastern Oregon forests. I have some housekeeping details. The Zoom toolbar should be located at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, scroll your cursor over that area and it should pop up. On some hardware, such as iPads, the Zoom toolbar is on top of the display. Many features can be accessed through that toolbar. Your audio as participants is muted unless unmuted by the host. Video is not available for participants. We'd like you to put questions in the Q&A box since you can't offer them verbally. Please put your written questions in the Q&A box, and we will be monitoring this throughout the webinar. Asking all of your questions to be written there, again, because we're not taking spoken questions. And the chat should only be used if you're having problems. And we have our co-host, Ryan Gordon from Department of Forestry, will be monitoring that. And if you do put a question in there by accident, he'll remind you to put it in the Q&A box. You can also use that to send messages to panelists and participants. Resources, a handout from this and links to other information can be found on the Tree School Online class guide. And that's a page that you can access from the Tree School Online page at knowyourforest.org. Click on the webinar description and look for the webinar that you're looking for. Immediately above the webinar is a link to instructor resources. We are recording these webinars so they'd be accessible after the fact. They'll be archived as YouTube videos accessible from the Tree School Online pages. Also, we're going to use some polls during this webinar at the beginning and an evaluation poll at the end to talk to you a bit and learn from you, the attendees, about you. And the poll should pop up on your screen in a box, and after you answer the questions, you can close the poll to make it go away. If you don't see the polls, check in the Zoom toolbar for a lighted button. The button appears, you should be able to pop it up when you press on that. So that's it for the housekeeping. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. And so we have three panelists, and Dan and Sarah and Norma, if you could all turn your video on, and we'll start to get to know you here. I'm going to give a little brief introduction for each of you, and then I'll turn it over to Dan to kick off the show. So first, Dan Stark is our OSU Extension Forestry and Natural Resource Extension Agent. He's out on the North Coast serving Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties based in Astoria. He's got a master's in wildland fire science and forest health from UC Berkeley. He's recently started that job. Just the last couple of years out on the North Coast. Before that, he was in Northern California. He spent 6 years working as a forest health researcher, program coordinator, and educator for UC Cooperative Extension in Humboldt and Del Norte counties, which happens to be part of the heart of sudden oak death territory, which we're going to learn about today. Sarah Navarro is the regional sudden oak death pathologist for the U.S. Forest Service, and she provides technical assistance to the Pacific Northwest region on sudden oak death and other invasive Phytophtheras. Before joining the Forest Service in June last year, Sarah worked for Oregon Department of Forestry, where I got to know her, and just for 4 years as a statewide forest pathologist. And so she's highly qualified there, and perhaps unfortunately has focused on sudden oak death quite a bit in her career. Good that we have her expertise. Norma Klein is the OSU Extension Forestry and Natural Resources Agent for Coos and Curry counties. So she's actually where we have sudden oak death in Oregon. She supports woodland owners and natural resource community through workshops, applied research, and she focuses on sudden oak death, as you might expect down there. Norma's been with OSU Extension since 2016, and prior to that, she worked in various aspects of forest management with the Oregon Department of Forestry and the U.S. Forest Service. And she also has degrees from UC Berkeley and a master's from Northern Arizona University. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dan to get us started, and then we'll have a poll of the audience. So go ahead, Dan. You're muted.
Can learn so many things about Zoom, but can't seem to get in the swing of unmuting ourselves. So, or myself, I'll take complete ownership of that. Thank you, Glenn. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit, just a kind of an intro today about what is a Phytophthora. So I have a background in some sudden oak death work. Yeah, Glenn was right. I was right down in Humboldt County, where that was first landed in about mid-2000s. And Sarah's going to talk to you a little bit more about that today. So we'll just get right started and go right into our first polling question. So let me advance the slide. Okay.
Okay. All right, I launched the poll, so you all should see it and go ahead and answer the questions, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we've learned.
So we want to know where you're coming from today and a little bit more about yourself. So are you a woodland owner? Are you a private natural resource professional? Those of you who have come to Tree School online have taken these polls before.
Just kind of have a fourth question too, specifically about sudden oak death. So we'll be interested to see where you're coming from there.
Yeah.
And it usually takes about a minute, and I just wait until the answers stop coming in, and we call it good. So then we'll share the results, and so we can all see where you're coming from. So we're getting to 75%, close to the magic 80%. It seems to be where it stops. We'll see if we can do better today. Let's aim for 90%. 87%. Very good. All right. I'm guessing that's all we're going to see. So I'm going to call it good and end the polling and share the results and talk through that a bit. First question, where are you from? Willamette Valley area is about 3/4 of us. Southwest Oregon, another good amount you'd expect. One from Central Eastern Oregon and one from Washington State. No one from outside of Oregon, Washington. Woodland owners, only about a third of woodland owners. We've got private natural resource professionals and agency folks, so that's about half. And then other folks, about 20% interested in the topic. As far as land ownership, again, about a third of folks don't own land, and then the rest of us are in that 10 to 40 acres is about 30%, and then in the middle, 40 to 100, and even over 1,000, there's about 10%. So some larger landowners here. So here's a question about your current level of knowledge about sudden oak death. And with this, I think I'll turn it over back to Dan and company. So almost half of our audience says no current level of knowledge, and moderate 45%. High level, there's 7%. So that's what we've learned, and I'm going to stop sharing those results and turn it back to you, Dan.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Glenn. And yeah, that gives us a lot of information. That's great that you might know something about sudden oak death, and completely okay if you don't. That's what we're here for, right? To give you some information. And for those of you who feel like they felt pretty comfortable with a lot of sudden oak death knowledge, I've been going through this material for years, and I can tell you I learn something new all the time. So hang tight, and we're going to talk to you about starting off with a little bit about forest Phytophthoras in general. And I have that we have another poll question here, but I think that was just tagged on to our sudden oak death question. So I just want to check for clarification with my cohort here and make sure that that's all okay.
Copy. Yeah, just
okay.
included. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Okay, all right, so a little bit of an overview of our talk today. First of all, what you're looking at to the right of the screen there is an infected tan oak that has recently died from sudden oak death. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. This was actually taken down near the in Mendocino County, which is just south of Humboldt County down there in California. Okay, a little bit about our talk today. I'm going to talk to you about, exactly what is this thing called a Phytophthora. You may have heard it before. You may be completely familiar with it. So we're going to go over what that is. We're going to then move into this case study and why you really are all here in wildlands. So then we're going to talk about sudden oak death, specifically in Curry County, Oregon, the only place in Oregon where it's currently located. We're going to start off with Sarah Navarro is going to talk to you about all kinds of things. What is sod? Where is it? What are the impacts? How does it spread? And what are the hosts and the treatments? Norma's going to be up next and complete our talk. She's going to talk to you about management options for landowners, the effectiveness of sod strategies, citizen or community science efforts, what to do if you suspect sudden oak death, and ways to prevent the spread of sudden oak death, as well as some additional resources for you. So I'm going to get started with this overview. And I just want to say, if you have any questions, if I'm saying anything here that doesn't make sense to you, if you're not certain about a specific term or something like that, please utilize that question and answer box and type your question in there, and we'll either get to that question here after my portion of the talk, or we'll address it when we have a question and answer session. So by all means, feel free to ask those questions in that box. So what is a Phytophthora? So it's pronounced Phytophthora, as you've heard me say, so you can have a look at how that's spelled there. That's probably one of the trickiest things about it, we wish. It is a type of fungus-like organism, so it's actually in the phylum Umicata, for those of you who are more on the sciencey nerd side, like me. So those include water molds and diatoms and brown algae. So they're a fungus-like organism. They're not a fungus. They have characteristics that are sort of like a fungus. So they reproduce or spread by spores. And they also have these root-like structures called hyphae, which are very similar to fungi, but they differ in very particular ways. So the Phytophtheras as a whole cause a variety of diseases of agricultural crops, shrubs, tree seedlings, and forest trees. They can be native, for example, from here, or invasive, or not from here, as an outside of the historic range, and often from other continents. Phytophtheras can occur in wildlands and agricultural systems, and in nurseries and restoration sites, and they've been detected in waterways and in soils. So one of the references I want to share with you, that I'm going to put it in your chat box right now, forest Phytophtheras of the world. So these used to be a little known organism. Now we have Phytophtheras of the world. So there are currently more than 100 identified species of Phytophthora worldwide, and the vast majority of them are plant pathogens. The name Phytophthora is derived from Greek, and it literally translates into plant destroyer. So if that gives you any kind of indication of what we're going to be talking about today, its name means plant destroyer. Phytophthora species are among the most destructive pathogens of agricultural crops and forests in the world. Okay, move on to our next slide. This is just a picture of the different spore types here under a microscope. These are not detectable by the naked eye, right? You need a microscope to see these Phytophthora. I won't go into those specific spore types, but you can look at Phytophthora of the world, and there's a great overview of Phytophtheras there. So if you want to get into some more sciencey type stuff, by all means, check out that resource. Okay, so continuing on with what is this Phytophthora then? Some noteworthy examples include the infamous Phytophthora infestans, which is portrayed on the left, that caused the Great Irish Potato Famine of the 1840s. So you can see that infected potato there at the top. So those are some symptoms of that pathogen, that Phytophthora. And then also on that potato plant on the bottom left part of your screen there, you can see some of those those, just some of that leaf necrosis or those dead spots on the leaf. So very minor looking systems, but has drastic impacts and caused a famine in the 1840s. Then also there's Phytophthora lateralis, which causes port orchard cedar root disease, which some of you might be a little bit more familiar with, especially if you live in more in the southern part of our state, or even in Portland here. So here's a picture that was taken right out of the Oregonian. This is a port orchard cedar hedgerow here that got infected. They were susceptible, of course, to the pathogen, and so you have this dieback of your hedgerow here. So it doesn't just happen in wildlands like you see here. It can also happen in urban and suburban settings as well. So yeah, here in Oregon, we have the two species that are currently causing forest diseases, this Phytophthora lateralis and then sudden oak death, which you're going to hear about momentarily. We're almost done. Don't let this scare you. There will be a quiz on this afterwards, so make sure you take careful notes. Just kidding. I want to show you an illustration of what an example of a Phytophthora life cycle is. This would be an example of the asexual reproduction, meaning it does not mate and do all those good things that result in all those good things that you get out of mating, like perhaps increased genetic fitness and all kinds of great things. So this is asexual reproduction, and I want to show you up here this Sporangia. So this is a spore type that's characteristic of these Phytophthora. They emerge from an oospore, and so then I'm going to show you a video here in a second of these zoospores. So you can look at these flagella here. They are motile in water, and they are the infective spore type. So fingers crossed that this is going to work for us. You're going to see an illustration of a microscope of this Sporangia releasing these infective zoospores. So fingers crossed, folks. Hooray, there we go. So here's our Sporangia here, characteristic spore type of Phytophtheras. So this is one spore here on a plate here. Here emerges these infective zoospores. So they have those flagella, those little tails, if you will, that help them swim through water. So you can see how abundant these are just from one Sporangia here. Here's two other here on that hyphae, that structure I was talking to you about that's like a root-like structure. So you can imagine how infective, or the potential these have to be super infective, especially in really wet, moist environments. They like water. Okay, I could watch this all day long here, but in the interest of saving some time, we're going to continue. I'm glad that worked. Thank you, universe. Okay, so just some known impacts on Phytophtheras, and I'm going to talk to you specifically in just some nursery and then in wildlands also. So some nursery impacts. Yes, these are found in nurseries, these Phytophthora, and often that's the source for these forest pathogens. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit in more detail about that in a second. So these nursery impacts really do depend on the physical and geographical location of the nursery. So that is the type of structure it is housed in. So that physical impact location, is it all indoors? Is it a greenhouse? Does it have a lot of ventilation in it? So that physical location is important, and also the geographical location. So is it in an area that could be a hotbed for spread, for example. These impacts also depend on environmental conditions and on other factors that contribute to disease introduction, spread, and establishment. So impacts can have costs that can be a one-time cost, and they can also be reoccurring. So those type of impacts that do impact forests there. So those impacts also can have rippling effects, so rippling impacts. So not just treating the soil, for example, that you would have to do in a nursery, but you might have to hire an extra crew who's like restructuring your whole nursery. So there are some impacts that will ripple through here because of these Phytophtheras that couldn't get into a nursery setting. Reducing Phytophthora in nurseries is actually a key strategy for protecting the health of wildlands, especially for native plant nurseries. Without management and with conditions supporting disease, a high percentage of nursery plants could be a source of Phytophthora. Diseased nursery plants in potting soil infested with pathogenic, so disease-causing Phytophthora, can be introduced unknowingly into wildland and forest areas, and can become a source of spread to other plant hosts that are out there. The long-term costs of managing diseases after Phytophthora are introduced into these wildlands are much greater than preventing efforts in the nurseries in the first place. Impacts in Phytophthora in wildlands, for example, mixed evergreen forests and oak woodlands and coastal forests, and perhaps on your property, if you live in one of these forests, depend all on site conditions and other variables, as is the case with other diseases that you might have in your forest or your woodland, such as species composition. So are there susceptible hosts present in your forest or the forest of interest? And density, do you have a large stand of tan oak, or do they just kind of occur patchy as a patchy distribution on your forest or on your property? Also, there are some site conditions like soil moisture and average rainfall. Is it a dry forest, like on certain forests in our eastern part of the state, or are they wet, or more like our wet coastal forests? Of course, other ambient conditions like temperature, prevalent wind direction, etc., and all are factors that influence how, when, and to what extent a Phytophthora can infest a wildland. So that concludes my introduction to these Phytophthoras overall in general. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Sarah's going to take it over for here and really get into the gist of our discussion today, which is this case study about sudden oak death in wildlands. So I will hand that over to you, Sarah, as soon as I stop sharing. Okay. I just want to check to see, it looks like there aren't any questions in the Q&A box, so I will just move right along.
Not yet. Thank you, Dan. Okay, so as Dan mentioned, we really wanted to start it off with an overview of Phytophthora because they are organisms that we typically don't hear about every day. And so it's just great to have that general background that Dan just presented to kind of get us into the right mindset and frame to then talk about Phytophthora ramorum, or sudden oak death here in Oregon. And so Phytophthora ramorum is a relatively new pathogen of worldwide importance. We think it was originally introduced to North America in the mid-90s into California. It's since spread up here into Oregon. And this is a non-native invasive pathogen here in Oregon. And so the native range of Phytophthora ramorum is currently unknown. We don't know its natural range or distribution. Researchers within the last few years believe that the origin may be northern Vietnam, and so there's some research going on out there to try to pinpoint that. And here in Oregon and in California, it causes extensive mortality of tan oaks and also coast live oak in California. And as you can see in the photo on the top left, those red canopies there are all tan oaks in the Big Sur region down in California. And in England, in the United Kingdom, they are seeing larch plantations dying as a result of infections with Phytophthora ramorum. So these are planted Japanese larch plantations throughout the United Kingdom, as well as in Northern Ireland, in Ireland as well, where they're seeing this extensive mortality of larch. And they also see western hemlock and Douglas fir trees damaged there when grown in close proximity to these larch plantations. And so these, like Dan showed us with the life cycle, Phytophthora ramorum produces Sporangia. As you can see a photo there on the top right, and the zoospores coming out of there. And then on the bottom right, that leaf disc, it's a rhododendron leaf disc, and you can see the hyphae coming out. And then on the very tips of the hyphae, the Sporangia, or the spores, the infective structures of Phytophthora ramorum that then get moved around during rain and wind events. And we'll go more into how Phytophthora ramorum is spreading in our Oregon forest in a couple slides. But here in Oregon, tan oak is the key host species to and is the driver of sudden oak death in our Oregon forest. And that's because it's readily infected and killed by Phytophthora morum, and is also the main spore producer. So the Sporangia that we saw, it's the main producer of those infective spores that can spread across the landscape, as well as intensify on a local area. And so here in Oregon, we also have many other plant species that can become infected, typically only when near infected tan oak, but they are regulated on both a federal and state level. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the management section for sudden oak death. And so we see many other native species are on the host list, and these include rhododendron, Douglas fir, grand fir, redwood, as well as Oregon myrtle. And one thing that we really like to point out because a lot of the resources out there have been produced in California because the disease was there first. And in a lot of the California sudden oak death resources, they really focus on California bay laurel or also Oregon myrtle. But here in our Oregon forest, we do not see Oregon myrtle as a factor in disease spread in Oregon. So we don't see it as the main driver of the disease on the landscape that they do in California. And so symptoms on tan oak, the driver of this disease here in our Oregon forest, infections in tan oak typically start in the tops of the canopies and with the development of the stem and twig lesions, like you can see in the photo on the left. And so these lesions can form spores, and those spores then get mixed around in the canopy, forming other twig lesions, as well as the spores being rained down onto the stems of tan oaks. And so once the spores get rained down onto the stems, the spores then work their way into the bark of tan oak and cause stem girdling lesions. And so here's a photo of what is a lesion underneath the bark. And so on the outside of the bark, when we are in the woods looking at tan oaks that could potentially be infected with sudden oak death, we see this bleeding on the outside of the bark, as well as sometimes just a stain. So if there's been a really heavy rain event, the bleeds will get washed away, but you can still see the stain of that bark. And then when you go to remove the bark from the stems of the tan oak, we can see these cankers underneath. And so these are two different examples of what the cankers of Phytophthora morum sudden oak death can look like when you take away the bark. And so eventually these cankers will continue to girdle the entire stem of the tree, of the tan oak tree, and will lead to the death of the tree. And that's where then we see the whole tree, the whole canopy of the tree turn brown and turn red, where we see mortality. And from an initial infection of a spore up in the canopy of a tan oak to when the tan oak completely dies from sudden oak death can be anywhere from 1 to 2 years. And so that's where that time from initial infection, when the canopy still looks green and when the tree looks healthy, to when we're able to detect it on the landscape, it really hinders us in terms of early detection, rapid response, which is what you hear about a lot in invasive species management. And so spread for Phytophthora morum in our Oregon forests, it can sporulate year-round, but it does require moisture. So we typically do see a downturn in spore production during the dry summer months, so June, July, and August. And you can have both local spread as well as aerial spread. So in the graphic on the left, this is an example of local spread, so local intensification. You have an infected tan oak, spores being produced by the canopy of that tan oak, and then they get rained down during wind and rain events onto other local hosts in the area, like rhododendron and evergreen huckleberry underneath. And then those spores can also be washed down to the stems of the tan oaks, to where it then leads to mortality of those trees. And then you also can see long distance dispersal with the spread of the spores from the canopy through turbulent transfer. So this happens during wind and rain events on our Oregon coast, where we can see natural spread of sudden oak death of up to 5 miles during one wind and rain event on the Oregon coast. And we can also have very long distance spread via infected host material. So like Dan was mentioning, with nurseries and Phytophthora spreading in nurseries through infected plant material, we can also have that type of spread in Oregon forests. And we have 2 examples here in Oregon where infected nursery stock was most likely the cause of a new introduction to our Oregon forest. So let's see if I can remember how to do the annotate and draw. So here on the slide, within these light green stands of trees, these are all tan oaks. The darker green is a mixture of Douglas fir and alder. And you see within these stands of tan oaks, just these single brown canopies. And this is back in 2012, and this is where there's an area outside of Brookings where the amount of disease on the landscape was larger than the amount of treatment funding that the program had, and so we had to not treat these areas. And so as you see the years go by on these high-resolution aerial imagery photos, in 3 years you have up to 50 to 80% mortality within these stands of tan oaks. And then fast forward to just this past July, you see some of those stands of tan oaks no longer look like stands of trees were even there, and you have brush filling in behind them. So here in Oregon, we've had 3 introductions of sudden oak death to our Oregon forest. First discovered in 2001 via aerial helicopter survey right outside of the city of Brookings. It was most likely introduced in the late 90s to Oregon. We think from infected nursery stock from California using genetic analysis. And then we've had 2 other introductions here in Oregon. The second one in 2010 in Cape Sebastian, which is about 10 miles south of Gold Beach. And then the third introduction was in that same area, but a different lineage of the disease. And so Phytophthora morum, there are 4 different lineages. Just like we're now hearing about COVID-19 strains and variants, Phytophthora morum has something similar. And so we have 4, and we have the European strain. It was first described in Europe, and so we've had that recently introduced to our Oregon forest, discovered in 2015. And so it's a strain that is more aggressive than the other strain that was here in our Oregon forest. And so the treatment and management for that strain has been the top priority for the Forest Service, ODF, and BLM. And so here in Oregon, we have a sudden oak death program to manage and try to slow the spread of this disease throughout the range of tan oak. And so this program comprises of 5 components, and all of these are collaboratively and cooperatively worked on with all of our land management agencies here in Oregon, the U.S. Forest Service, Oregon Department of Forestry, Bureau of Land Management, as well as Oregon State University and the Oregon Department of Agriculture, all working together to try to slow this disease here in Oregon. And so we have the survey and detection of the disease, and this is done through aerial surveys, through stream surveys, through ground transect surveys, so getting boots on the ground to sample all of these trees, because sudden oak death, as Dan mentioned, you can really only see those structures under a microscope. And so all of the trees that are determined to have sudden oak death have to be laboratory confirmed. And so all of the samples get sent to Oregon State University for this. Once we find a new positive tan oak tree, we then have crews go in and delimit the site to see how many trees are infected and how big the infection is. We then propose a treatment, and I'll go through what the treatment comprises of, and then also regulation and education, like this workshop here, as well as other events that Norma hosts on the coast, trying to get the word out to folks of what to look for, who to inform if you do have an infestation, and then continuing monitoring and research, where Oregon State University is looking at the effectiveness of treatments, as well as working with other universities across the U.S. to look at disease spread, as well as overall effectiveness of the program. And so, as I mentioned, regulation is one of the main components of the program, and this is also one of our main focuses of management. So to manage the spread of sudden oak death here in Oregon, we have a state quarantine. And you can see in the GIF on the left, the quarantine line, the yellow line, has expanded throughout the years to encompass the amount of infection on the landscape. And so under the quarantine regulations through the Oregon Department of Agriculture, it requires private and state landowners to treat sudden oak death on their property, and federal land managers do the same on theirs as well. And ODF, in the cases where treatments are required under the quarantine, pays for treatment on private landowner property. And then it also requires some special permits are required for the harvest of tan oak outside of the quarantine area to make sure we're not we're not allowing the movement of infected material out to other potential areas where it could become infective. And this started as an eradication program in 2001, but had to shift to a slow the spread program in 2010, when we just realized the amount of disease on the landscape, we did not have enough resources to continue an eradication program. And so this is, in 2012, we established the generally infested area, which under the quarantine regulations, treatments are no longer required for private and state-owned lands within that generally infested area. And this is a way for us to be able to prioritize treatments and management on the landscape given the resources that we have. And so disease treatment for sudden oak death, when we learn in Forest Pathology 101, we think of the disease triangle. And so in order to have a tree or plant disease on the landscape, you need the host, so tan oak, you need the right environment, which in our case in Oregon are these moist, wet, coastal forests. And then you need the pathogen sudden oak death. And so when we think about disease management, we think about trying to alter that disease triangle. And in the case of sudden oak death, our tools in the toolbox are very limited. And so our only effective tool that we have at this point is host removal, so removing tan oak from the equation for disease. And so our treatments for sudden oak death include using herbicide, as well as cutting and burning tan oak and other infective host material within a certain buffer zone. Because I mentioned it can take anywhere from 1 to 2 years where we can visibly see that a tan oak is infected. We then, in these treatment areas, we use a buffer of 300 to 600 feet to try to get any potentially any infected tan oaks out. And out of the landscape and out of the airstream where they could then move spores across the landscape. And so we know that larger treatment areas of 300 to 600 foot buffers are the most effective, but in some years, given our budgets, we have to do less. And it's because these are very labor-intensive treatments, they cost about $5,000 to up to $8,000 an acre. And as I mentioned before, there's no cost to private landowners where the treatment's required under quarantine rule, but at the same time, there's no compensation for the loss of tan oak. We typically the Oregon Department of Forestry does work with private landowners to replant conifer tree species in areas where there's a big enough opening to do so after treatments. And to date, the sudden oak death program here in Oregon has treated about 7,300 acres for sod. And so the risk of disease spread here in Oregon is mainly driven by the abundance of tan oak on the landscape. So our efforts focused in Curry County we're trying to slow the spread of this disease into Coos, Douglas, and Josephine County, because it does have the potential to spread throughout the range of tan oak. And the Oregon Department of Forestry contracted out an economic impact assessment in 2019 and found a 19-to-1 cost benefit to continue to slow the spread of sudden oak death in Oregon forests. To date, about $31 million has been spent to slow the spread of this disease in Oregon, but the economic impact assessment found that the potential is out there for sanctions to be put on Oregon timber products coming out of the port of Coos Bay if the sudden oak death quarantine was to expand into Coos County. So land management agencies are all in this together to continue to slow the spread of sudden oak death in Oregon. So with that, I think we will stop for some questions.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I guess you could stop sharing your screen and we'll see. I don't see any questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
I think you've been so thorough in your educational presentation here, but if anyone has a question, please put it in there in the Q&A. I guess since I don't see a question, I can always come up with one. What about, you said it's driven by tan oak, but what about chinkapin and other oak species that are abundant in Southwest Oregon? Are they potentially hosts and spreaders for this disease?
So California black oak as well as coast live oak are found in very disjunct populations in where we currently have sudden oak death infestations, and we've never seen any infections in them. But many of the other oak species that are out there are what's known as dead end hosts, and so they have those stem girdling cankers form, but then they are not sporulating hosts. And Dan has a lot more experience with those coming from California than we really see in Oregon. We really are focused on tan oak as the driver of the disease.
So in California, the laurel umbellularia actually is a sporulating host, but we're not seeing that here, is what I gathered. Is that right?
Yeah, we rarely see Oregon myrtle infected in our sudden oak death infestation areas. We have tested, we put out, and Norma will show an example of this in her presentation, but putting out rain buckets to try to trap those spores, and we just rarely see infection.
Okay. Dan, did you have anything to add there? Okay. Now we have some questions. So are log exports from Oregon to Asia prohibited?
They are not prohibited. However, if the quarantine and sudden oak death was to expand into Coos County, they could be prohibitive. And that was one thing that the economic impact assessment, they weren't able to nail down if and when or what the percentage of if it would be prohibitive, but the potential is there.
Okay, yeah, that's right. That's the big threat if it spreads more. Another question, rather than burn the tan oak, can't we use the logs for lumber, chips, etc., firewood?
So we do allow folks within the generally infested area to use the logs for lumber and firewood if it stays there. But those spores, the Sporangia, we do find them on those stem girdling cankers. And so the potential, the risk for spread is still there on the boles of the trees. And so the quarantine regulations are written such to really limit the spread of those.
Okay.
But we are, and this is something that Norma, we have been looking a little bit into, looking into biochar as an option for doing something with the logs. And so on a local level, there's some folks out there looking at that.
Okay. another question, with many of us hailing from the Willamette Valley, is the Oregon white oak a dead-end host, or are there any, threatened species or potential spreaders that might be pertinent in the Willamette Valley?
Yeah, so Oregon white oak is actually one of the oaks not on the host list for Phytophthora morum. The host list has over 100 species of plants and trees on there, and Oregon white oak is not one of them, which is nice for us in the Willamette Valley. And so we have never seen natural infection of Oregon white oak. It has been used in laboratory settings for inoculation trials. And when you pinprick the hyphae and sporangia of Phytophthora morum into underneath the bark of Oregon white oak, we can see a lesion develop, but we've never seen that outside of a laboratory setting.
Okay. Well, we don't have any new questions. I bet you Norma's talk will generate some more, and then we can always add more at the end as they come in. So I'll give it another few seconds. No more new questions. Okay, in that case, thank you, Sarah, and we'll turn it over to Norma.
Well, great. Can folks see my first slideshow slide here?
Yes, it's looking good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to continue this discussion and talk about management strategies for sudden oak death. And so as the forestry extension agent for the South Coast, I get a lot of questions from folks about how they should manage their forests in regards to sudden oak death risk, what species should they plant or not plant. And my answer is always, it depends. And so your management strategy for sudden oak death risk will really depend on your location in relationship to the quarantine area. And of course, with everything in regards to land stewardship, it will depend on your own management goals and also your risk tolerance. And so I'm going to start out by talking about planting considerations, and then I will cover other management strategies in just a bit. So in thinking about species to plant, it's important to recognize that while a number of native plant species are listed as host species on the USDA regulated host list, not all hosts support spread of the pathogen through sporulation or die from the disease. And so, for example, Douglas fir is a host, but it's not known to spread the disease in Oregon. So landowners with a timber management goal would likely choose to continue to plant Douglas fir as it is low risk and it's a high value tree. So what about folks who have wildlife goals and would like to restore tan oak in the generally infested area? So tan oak is important to wildlife because it's a mass producing hardwood. And deer eat it, and pollinators and bird habitat, and all sorts of values there for tan oak. But unfortunately, tan oak is one of the key species, as Sarah mentioned, that spreads the disease, and it has a high mortality rate in the generally infested area, or anywhere it would be infested. So tan oak would be an extremely high-risk species to plant with a very low chance of success. So if you want to help limit the spread of sudden oak death in the quarantine area, we suggest to avoid planting species that spread the disease through sporulation. And so avoid planting tan oak or rhododendrons. And I would also avoid planting azalea or huckleberry or madrone or manzanita or salal in or near infested areas, because all those species have the potential of being infested and even spreading the disease through sporulation. So if you're concerned with mortality and infection of new plantings in the quarantine area, consider planting species that are not susceptible to sun oak death. So I like to think about this as a continuum of risk. So on this slide, we have rhododendron, which would be a high-risk species to plant because, of course, it can spread the pathogen through sporulation. And on the very low end of the risk continuum is red alder, which is no risk or very low risk because it's not susceptible, as far as we know, to sun oak death. And just to add, for folks in designated treatment areas that Sarah mentioned, ODF can provide guidance with planting options also. So what plants native to the South Coast are not susceptible to sun oak death? Well, the list is fairly short, and that's because so many of our native shrubs are in the heath family, and members of that family tend to be very susceptible to sun oak death. But we do have some really great suggestions. Red alder, shore pine, Port Orford cedar, coyote brush, ocean spray, and red elderberry are some. And if you're interested in species that I don't mention here, you can reach out to me and I can help you figure out if it's considered susceptible or not. So the plants that I have in this slide, though, are actually rock stars in the plant world. So, for example, red alder is our only native tree that fixes nitrogen from the air. Shore pine is a tough tree that does very well in the fog belt. Western red cedar is a tree with significant cultural significance to the tribes. Coyote brush is a tough survivor on poor sites. Ocean spray does really well on rocky or disturbed sites, and it's a pretty shrub as well. Red elderberry has a dense rooting structure that can stabilize soil along riparian areas and forest edges. And Port Orford cedar is a really beautiful tree that has a limited range from the south coast of Oregon, of Oregon to Northern California. But if you would like to plant Port Orford cedar, I recommend acquiring disease-resistant seedlings, because although Port Orford cedar is not susceptible to sun oak death, it is susceptible to another invasive Phytophthora, the Port Orford cedar root disease. So now we're going to move on from planting to potential management approaches. So what is the effectiveness of the various sun oak death treatment strategies? So forest pathologists are focused on learning more about sun oak death to help develop control strategies. And effective strategies would be those that are inexpensive and widely and safely applicable over the landscape. So as Sarah mentioned, the primary method used at this point is burning to eradicate infested material. So in this strategy, infested material is cut, piled, and burned. And the effectiveness of this approach is high if it's detected early and if all the target species are removed within the prescribed buffer. But it has a high cost. So what other options have folks been thinking about? So what about thinning to promote stand health? Well, it's not known. Likely, it's not effective to control sun oak death due to the foliage infestation in tan oak. But there are general forest health benefits to thinning. But we don't know the relationship between plant health and susceptibilities to sun oak death. So there's also been discussion in regards to harvesting healthy tan oak as a preventative measure. So in other words, harvesting a large swath of tan oak in the front of the infested area. But this, the effectiveness of this is actually not known either. And it would need to be weighed with the value of retaining tan oak for ecosystem values and the risk of losing genetic diversity and potential resistant trees. So what about controlled burning as a measure in the understory? Once again, the effectiveness of this isn't known, but it's likely not effective to stop the spread due to the nature of foliage infestation with this disease. Although, there are many other ecosystem benefits to controlled burning. So lastly, how about chemicals? How about chemical treatments like phosphonates or phosphite treatments? These actually may promote the survival of some tan oak in the generally infested area. But one would need to consider the risk of disease infestation and the expense of your treatments. And also, there's a caveat with this. If you were to treat an area that or treat a tan oak in an area that became infested anyway, those trees would need to be cut, whether or not they're treated with phosphonate. So phosphonate is applied either through injection or topically on the bark, and follow-up annual treatments are typically necessary to provide continued protection. And the cost is dependent on the application method and the size of the tree. And so tan oak treated with phosphonate, it might still become infested in the upper branches, providing a breeding ground for further sporulation and spread. So at this time, phosphonate might be used primarily in an effort to keep important trees alive in infested areas. So if folks in the generally infested area are interested in phosphonate treatments, we can direct you to the guidance in the Pacific Northwest Disease Handbook, which has some protocol on how to do that. And so once again, research is still ongoing in all of these areas. So another avenue of research is focused on finding tan oak trees that are genetically resistant to sudden oak death and using them to establish a breeding program. And so currently we are searching for surviving tan oak. So acorns from potential trees have been grown in early trials to test resistance. But this is going to be a fairly long-term project. So for example, a porphyrid cedar root rot resistance breeding program was initiated in 1997, and it's had promising results. But once again, genetic breeding programs are a long-term research. So kind of moving on from what the formal research folks are doing, we have several citizen science opportunities for folks on, particularly on the leading edge of the disease in Curry County. So landowners are helping us monitor for sudden oak death by deploying and monitoring bait stations. These are buckets with bait leaves placed under apparently healthy tan oak. But if the tan oak is actually infested, its spores can drip down and into the buckets and infesting the bait leaves that are placed in the buckets. And then our citizen scientists are collecting these bait leaves and sending them into the diagnostic lab at OSU. And we also have a similar part of that project in streams. Bait leaves in streams can help identify if there's potentially infested trees up in the drainage that you might not be able to see or be able to detect. And so once again, the spores of these infested trees drip off into the water, and the bait leaves, if they become infested, will pick up if that stream has infested tan oak up in the upper reaches. So both of these projects are for the early detection of the disease. And so if you live in Curry County and would like to participate, let me know. I'd really like to get you involved. They're fun. And so another project we're doing uses this Tree Snap app. We are using, basically we're using crowdsourcing to help with the search for potentially disease-resistant trees in the generally infested area. So folks who live or work in the generally infested area and notice a surviving dead tan oak in a sea of dead tan oak, they can help us by recording that location with the Tree Snap app, and we'll follow up on it. So how can you prevent, so moving on to how can folks prevent the spread of this disease? So firstly, know where the quarantine area is and follow the quarantine restrictions. And don't move plant and soil materials out of the quarantine area. And this includes firewood. And buy healthy plants from reputable nurseries. And so these actions will also help prevent the inadvertent spread of other invasive insects and diseases as well. So how do you report? So you think you might have a sun oak death infestation. So how do you report new possible locations so you know for sure? So if you're located outside of a known infested area in Curry County, you can contact the Oregon Department of Forestry office in Brookings. And in our classes, additional resources that will be available today, we have a publication that has all these contact phone numbers and email addresses and so on. So if you're located outside of Curry County, you can contact your local Oregon State University Extension office. And if you're an Oregon nursery owner or worker or a Christmas tree grower, you should contact the Oregon Department of Agriculture's Plant Health Program. And so this extension publication, Sun Oak Death Prevention, Recognition, and Restoration, is a nice little guide to have if you want to read about this subject more further. And it also has the phone numbers and contacts for all those folks to contact if you think you might have the disease. And that is all I have.
All right, thank you, Norma. And let's see now, what happened to all the questions? There were a couple in there, and now they're gone. Looks like somebody's been typing the answers to the questions, but I might want to put them out there for the benefit of others. So there was I see that Sarah's been busy answering questions, so let's repeat some of those. One is, does Douglas fir contain the pathogen and kill it? So Sarah, what about Douglas fir? How it's a host, but are we worried about it?
Right, it's on the host list, but we typically aren't worried about it here in Oregon. We see shoot and tip dieback in Douglas fir, usually just on the new year's growth, and it's only when the Douglas fir are growing in close proximity to infected tan oaks, so they're getting rained down with spores. And we've never seen mortality here in Oregon. And in laboratory studies at Oregon State University, they have been looking to see if Douglas fir is a sporulating host like tan oak with the new European strain, as well as the strain that we have here in Oregon, and they haven't observed any sporulation on Douglas fir. So we see it as one of those kind of just bystander host species in our forest where it gets some shoot tip dieback, but really nothing else.
Okay, well, that seems like relatively good news. Another question was about blue elderberry. Is it susceptible? And I think Dan answered that one.
Yeah, so that was a good question. So there's, we mentioned that red elderberry was a suitable host. So those elderberries are Sambucus species. So I just posted a link into the chat box to the USDA Animal and Plant Inspection list, a plant host list, that APHIS plant list for sudden oak death. So that gives a full list of technically susceptible hosts to the sudden oak death pathogen. And I just want you to put it out there also that just because a plant shows up on that list doesn't necessarily mean that it's a significant pathogen for that host, or necessarily that host will die from the pathogen. So there's a huge host list, as you'll see on that list. So it's a ubiquitous host list. So we don't know how infective all those hosts are, and it's believed, and Sarah, you can chime in here too, that they really play an insignificant role, at least in our current understanding, in the actual spread of the pathogen. So just a caution about that plant list. Don't get too freaked out.
Okay. There was a comment here. I think it's worth sharing, that someone's observing that, if there's a community of tan oak that's tolerant or resistant to sudden oak death, but if we're eradicating or burning the tan oak, then we're not going to identify that resistant group. So, I mean, are we worried about getting rid of too much of the tan oak before we find out where the resistant genetics are?
Well, I would say that there's a very large area in Curry County, in the generally infested area, that is not being treated. And so there's, the entire extent of tan oak that's being infected is not necessarily being treated.
Yeah, well, with 7,300 acres being treated and the millions of acres that have tan oak, and I would guess that on the one hand, we're not going to be able to get rid of a lot of the hosts and prevent the spread that much. But on the other hand, there's plenty of tan oak out there that we can learn from, and we're not going to be destroying that much of it.
I wanted to chime in on that too, if I can, Glenn. I posted in the comments section there too, if this is something that folks are concerned about, be assured that the Dorena Genetic Resource Center here in Oregon has been undertaking extensive acorn collections throughout California and all throughout Oregon. And they're growing those acorns, and they're going to be, testing for resistance there, or some kind of tolerance at least. So there are efforts underway to look at that. They take a long time. So you can keep up to date with those. You can contact follow along at the Dorena Genetic Resource Center. It'd be helpful for you to find out what that is, if I could pronounce it correctly, and follow that along. Check out, ask Norma, or reach out to us, and we can help you with that too.
All right, thanks, Dan. Another question, could sudden oak death mutate and adapt to regions in the West Cascades or foothills to become a problem? Or is it something we should not be concerned about, north and east of the Coast Range?
I can take a first stab at this and then have Dan and Norma chime in. Like Dan mentioned in the beginning of his slides and in his talk, Phytophthora morum here in our Oregon forest is reproducing asexually. And so because of that, we don't see the sexual recombination of DNA and genes. And so so this type of organism doesn't mutate or change its adaptation very quickly. And so we are just seeing this clonal population here in Oregon. And so we haven't really seen any shift in how the disease acts on our Oregon landscape. Doesn't mean it can't, but we haven't seen it. And we don't, and with this asexual reproduction, it's just it's a lower chance. But that's not to say that we don't have other Phytophthora issues in our Western Cascades and foothills. And so recently in 2015, 2016, we were seeing lower crown needle casting in Douglas fir up here in the northern Coast Range, as well as in some of the Cascades area of Phytophthora pluvialis. And it's a Phytophthora that we believe is native here to Oregon, but we only see blips of it every so often if the weather conditions are correct. And so there are other Phytophthoras that we have to think about here in our Oregon forests. And so, but in terms of sudden oak death as a concern in the north or east of the Coast Range, it's not something that we typically think about because of the risk of the disease is really driven by that abundance of tan oak, the sporulator that's out there.
Okay, and that leads to a question that I've had because I'm thinking about the concern, and I usually end up looking at the bigger question of the best practices for nurseries or for moving plant materials, because this is a sort of the bigger issue about a lot of folks that are, moving plants around, or some of the more, amateur nurseries, or myself. I transplant and propagate things and put them into pots and move them around. And that's, if you're not careful with improper practices, you might be spreading pathogens. So that to me is like one of the big take-home lessons about this, is that the quarantine around moving stuff around to prevent sudden oak death spread is really something we should be paying attention to for all the other pathogens as well, that we don't want to be moving. We want to have best practices for propagating plants and moving those plant materials around, particularly just nurseries and making sure your pots are clean and the growth media is not infected with something that might get transferred.
Yeah. Another thing too is the Oregon Department of Agriculture keeps a list of licensed nurseries in the state, because there are some nurseries within Oregon that are regulated for the presence of Phytophthora ramorum. If Phytophthora ramorum is present at an Oregon nursery, they are not on the list of licensed nurseries on the Oregon Department of Agriculture's webpage. So it's important to make sure you're buying, in addition to having clean pots and clean soil and media, making sure you're buying plants from a reputable source as well.
There's another question here.
Glenn, I just wanted to just chime in real quick on that, just to tell him what Sarah said, and just to underscore the importance of that. So, a lot of us are, plant geeks, and we just love plants, and we hate to see plants that are at the store that are dying. And it looks just like, you know what, I can bring that home and I can bring it back to life. After all, it's only 50% off. So there's a reason that plant is sick and not doing well. So think about that, and really think about that risk that you might be introducing into your other plants around your garden as well. It might not be a Phytophthora or anything that might be harm a forest, but it could be. So leave those plants alone. Just look for those healthy plants from a reputable source, and by all means, don't move your firewood. Buy it where you burn it.
And to add on that, even, if you buy, like me, gardener, I love to buy new plants for my landscape, it's a really good practice to have a quarantine area in your own place that you separate your new purchases and, keep good care of them. You want to plant them out, but also keep a watch, make sure they don't have any symptoms. And if they do, you can, unfortunately, you'd have to, get them checked out.
Another question related to the ericaceous species, the heath family. So rhododendron and vaccinium, the huckleberries, azaleas, madrone perhaps. So those species are often commonly planted as ornamentals, and they move around a lot. And that seems like that's one of the fears for spreading sudden oak death, is it particularly those rhododendrons, for example. That's what I hear about. I mean, is there a possibility that in native forests that have abundant rhododendron and vaccinium and other of those native understories, if those became infected at a high rate, then that's another way it could spread outside of the tan oak zone, isn't it? Are the rhododendrons a risk for spreading it outside of the tan oak zone? Let's put it that way. Are they sporulating on rhododendrons?
We do see some sporulation on rhododendron, not to the same extent as we see tan oak, but also you have a difference in canopy structure between those two plant species. So rhododendron is going to be an understory shrub species, and it's not at that canopy, like codominant canopy layer, where then you have the spores moving from tree to tree to tree in terms of landscape spread. So it's really that landscape level spread, that intensification in both the upper canopy and then lower canopy is what we're really worried about. But definitely not moving rhododendron or buying rhododendron from a really reputable source is highly, highly encouraged. One instance that I was a part of before working at the Oregon Department of Forestry, I worked for the Oregon Department of Agriculture in their Phytophthora in nurseries program, and I was sent up to Astoria. There was a landowner who sent in a couple samples of their viburnum shrubs in Astoria proper, and it turns out that they were infected with Phytophthora amorum. They were most likely purchased infected from the nursery 8 years prior, and they had just started showing leaf symptoms. And the homeowner submitted samples, and we ended up going and removing those plants out of their landscaping, out of their yards for them, and destroying them. And that was an instance where we did have it outside of our quarantine area, but we didn't see those viburnums causing any infection in the adjacent Douglas fir or any other native trees or native forests as well.
Well, more on that, the vacciniums of the rhododendrons. So there's a question, blueberry is a vaccinium, and are they susceptible? And in general, what's the threat to the understory? If the trees aren't, affected, that's great, but then there's still the potential for the understory to be devastated. What about blueberry, the crop, as well as the native vacciniums?
So blueberry crops here in Oregon, when they are shipped as seedling starts, there's a lot that gets shipped to Korea, and they do get visually inspected by the Oregon Department of Agriculture prior to shipment outside of Oregon. And so they are in the vaccinium family, but it's one of those hosts, just like Dan mentioned on that host list, that, we see a lot of, we don't see mortality typically in vaccinium. We see a lot of leaf spots and leaf symptoms.
So not a major threat to blueberries or huckleberries.
Right.
That's good to know. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions here. So this is a chance. I guess what we'll do now is I'm just going to put up a final poll and just get your opinion of the show today. And so if you would respond to this poll about our presentations, we're not going to discuss or share these. We just would like your input to help us and improve in the future. So that's running. And then also, if you would, why don't you put the upcoming attractions slides up? There should be some of those. And also, Ryan posted that if you wanted continuing education credits for Oregon professional loggers, we have a form you can fill out to get credit for continuing education there. And also want to let you know about upcoming programs. So the Managing Eastern Forests, actually this Thursday, it's going to be one on silvicultural systems. And that's a series that's going on for Eastern Forests fairly frequent webinars. So if you're interested in that, please check those out on the knowyourforest.org site. You see the schedule. Also, Amanda's reminding me that if you want to get continuing education as a Master Gardener, OSU Master Gardener, there's a form you can fill out to get credit for this education here as a Master Gardener. Then the next Tree School Online is going to be Ryan Gordon and Andrew Owen on landowner incentives and resources to help you with your land stewardship. And is there another one? Oh, yes. And then, of course, with the topic of wildfire fresh on our minds, there's a great story about a Colorado community's response, and they got burned by fire a decade or so ago, and they really got busy with fire prevention and preparedness. And then it, had definitely an impact when the next fires came. So there's a good story about that on January 25th from our Extension Fire Program team and the Wildfire Adapted Partnership in Colorado. So check those out. They're all going to be on the web. And thanks again for joining us today. And just want to give folks a chance if there's any more questions. I don't see any. So any other closing remarks from our panelists? Okay, everybody's quiet. Well, in that case, just thanks everybody. One of our attendees said thanks, and so I really appreciate it. And this is great for me. I don't normally get to see all the tree school talks when I'm organizing the in-person tree school in Clackamas, so this has always been good for me to learn a lot from you. So thank you for today. Thank you all for attending, and that's it for now. So goodbye, everybody.